A firefighter is forced to break open a bedroom door. It's been locked from the outside. Inside, a man lies lifeless on the bed. Parts of his body are severely burned, with the damage focused around his head and the bed frame. Yet strangely, the rest of the room remains almost untouched. Papers sit undisturbed on the desk. Even the curtains are still intact. It's the eve of Hari Raya Aidilfitri, a time when families across Malaysia are preparing to celebrate the end of Ramadan. But in this house, there will be no celebration, only grief. Instead of festivities, the family of Nazarin Hassan is preparing for a funeral. This is the mysterious case of Nazarin Hassan, one of the most controversial incidents in Malaysia's recent history, and a case that leaves behind more questions than answers.
It's the early hours of June 14th, 2018. In an affluent neighborhood in Petaling Jaya, Malaysia, a security guard notices something wrong. Smoke is rising from a two-story house. He walks closer and finds the homeowner's wife, Samira Muzaffar, standing on the porch. She isn't on the phone. She isn't calling for help. She isn't doing anything. For some reason, none of the members of the household called the emergency services. It was the neighbors who reached out for help. The firefighters arrived to find Samira still standing at the front door. She is completely expressionless. No crying, no wailing, even as her husband is burning in the room above her. There is no emotion at all. The firefighters rush upstairs. Inside the bedroom, they find Nazarin Hassan's body on the bed, with burn marks covering roughly 30% of his body. The room is partially burned, but the pattern doesn't look like that of an accidental fire. The damage is concentrated in specific areas, rather than spreading evenly across the room. Flammable items elsewhere are completely untouched. And another questionable detail is that Nazarin's body is just lying on the bed. There was no sign that he tried to escape, no sign that he tried to move at all. It was a very strange scene. What on earth had happened in this room? To understand why this case would go on to grip an entire nation, let's first look into who Nazarin Hassan was. He was the group CEO of Cradle Fund, a government-linked agency under Malaysia's Ministry of Finance. Cradle provided grant funding to early-stage technology startups, and over the years, it backed hundreds of companies, including a ride-hailing startup that would eventually become Grab. Within Malaysia's tech community, Nazarin was seen as something rare, a leading figure who genuinely understood entrepreneurship because he had actually lived it. Before running Cradle, he had been a startup founder himself. People who worked with him described him as articulate, thoughtful, and direct. He believed that entrepreneurs weren't just building businesses, they were trying to create something that mattered. He once said that Cradle's job was simply to help as many founders as possible reach commercial success, and that what they did with it after that was up to them. When people showed up for his funeral on June 15th, 2018, the turnout said everything. It was the kind of crowd you would expect for a head of state, not someone working behind the scenes at a grant agency. For many people in Malaysia's startup world, Cradle had been the only institution that ever believed their idea, and Nazarin had been the person behind that. For those who had questions about his death, his family and Cradle Fund had answers. Both groups stated that Nazarin had gone to sleep after taking medication for a migraine, and that while he slept, the BlackBerry phone charging behind his bed had exploded. The autopsy carried out at Kuala Lumpur Hospital appeared to support this. It concluded that his death was caused by complications from a blast and blunt, penetrating injuries, consistent with a phone explosion. A tragic accident, case closed, except 10 days after Nazarin had been laid to rest, everything changed. On June 25th, a forensic report from the Fire and Rescue Department came back, and its findings didn't match the official story at all. The department found traces of petrol on Nazarin's body, on the bed frame, on the mattress, and on his phone. In light of these findings, the state's Fire and Rescue Department director said it was far too early to conclude that the phone had caused the fire. Then, on August 6, 2018, the police made it official. The case was reclassified. Nazarin Hassan's death was no longer considered an accident. It was murder. Rather than waiting for the authorities to act, Nazarin's siblings began pushing for answers themselves. His older brother, Dr. Malek Hassan, was the first to publicly question the autopsy results. Another brother, Dr. Abdulaziz Hassan, was a lawyer and helped coordinate the family's efforts. And their sister, Che Eleni Che Hassan, obtained the death certificate and compared it to the Fire and Rescue Department's findings. And things weren't adding up. She made a formal request to the court for the right to exhume Nazarin's body for a second autopsy. On October 1st, 2018, the Magistrates Court granted police permission to do exactly that. But Nazarin's widow, Samira, was opposed to this, and her lawyers challenged the decision. But the High Court upheld the initial ruling. Nazarin's body was exhumed on October 8th and transported to the University of Malaya Medical Center for a second autopsy. And here they uncovered something that the first one had not. Nazarin had not died from an exploding phone. He had died from multiple blunt impacts to the head. On March 12, 2019, 4 people were formally charged with Nazarin's murder. The first was his widow, Samira Muzaffar. The second and third were her 2 teenage sons from a previous marriage, then aged 17 and 14. And the fourth was Eka Wahyu Lestari, an Indonesian domestic helper employed by the family. For some reason that has never been made clear, Eka was charged, but never actually arrested, so she was absent for all court proceedings. They were accused of killing Nazarin at his home, sometime between 11:30 p.m. on June 13th and 4 a.m. on June 14th. The charge was murder, but it was brought jointly against all of them. This meant the prosecution had to prove not only that they had murdered Nazarin, but that they had acted together with the shared intention to kill him. In Malaysia, murder carries a mandatory death sentence upon conviction, though that doesn't apply to anyone who was a minor at the time of the offense. The teenagers were safe, but Samira's life was on the line. The trial began on September 6, 2019, before the High Court in Shah Alam. All 3 who appeared in court pleaded not guilty. The courtroom was packed. Nazarin had been a prominent figure, and Samira was by no means unknown. She was a senior executive at the Malaysian Intellectual Property Corporation, and her father was Chandra Muzaffar, one of Malaysia's most prominent political scientists and human rights figures. Her father sat in the public gallery to support her. These were not people on the margins of society. They were educated, well-connected, and high-profile. Exactly the type of people to draw public attention. And the case itself was compelling. The prosecution wasn't just suggesting the fire had been set deliberately. They were saying Nazarin may have already been dead before the fire even started. Blood spatter found on the wall of the burned room matched Nazarin's DNA. A National Police forensic officer testified that the pattern was consistent with blunt force trauma, not a blast, and that it must have occurred before the fire, because the evidence of this was found beneath the soot. The prosecution argued that Nazarin had been struck in the head with something consistent with a hammer, and that the fire had been set deliberately, in targeted areas to destroy the evidence. But there was another forensic detail that raised even more questions. A prosecution forensic witness testified that Nazarin had a penetrating wound track in his brain, measuring 6.8 centimeters deep and 0.4 centimeters in diameter. So to put that in perspective, that's a wound track into the brain that's about the length of a dollar bill, through a channel half the width of a pencil.
Investigators also discovered a separate penetrating wound on the front of his neck. It raised a disturbing question. How could he have suffered such different types of injuries? Before the trial, authorities explored whether this particular wound might have been caused by something other than a bladed weapon. In September 2018, local reports revealed that one of Samira's teenage sons had been questioned in relation to the neck injury. There were suggestions that the wound could have been caused by an arrow, and notably, both boys were members of their school's archery club.
These details were never formally established in court. No findings were ever made linking any specific injury to a particular weapon or person. These remain allegations. But there were other things found at the scene that raised their own questions. When a forensic officer visited the house in September 2018, 3 months after the incident, he found 3 fragments in the compound consistent with arrow components. And inside the house, in a storeroom, he found a CCTV recorder. It hadn't been switched off. It had been completely disconnected from its wiring and removed from sight. So whatever happened in that house between 11:30 p.m. and 4 a.m. went undocumented. A firefighter also testified that on the morning of June 14th, the day Nazarin's body was discovered, he saw one of the teenagers leaving the house with a box. What was inside has never been discovered. But what could their motive have been? As the trial progressed, the prosecution called a series of witnesses to build a picture of the household. As a family unit, Samira and Nazarin had one son together, and both had children from previous marriages. From the outside, it looked like a stable, successful household. Nazarin's personal assistant called this into question, testifying that Nazarin's work performance had declined after the marriage. A colleague described moments where Nazarin seemed unsettled after phone calls with his wife and said he had spoken about her spending and at times had mentioned considering a divorce. The marriage may not have been as happy as it once seemed. There were also reports that Nazarin had received threatening phone calls, which he later discovered had come from one of Samira's children. The court also heard that Nazarin's clothing had been deliberately damaged by that same child. The defense pushed back on the prosecution's portrayal of a fractured family. Nazarin's driver testified that family outings in the months before his death seemed completely normal, nothing out of the ordinary. In addition, text messages from Samira's phone in the days before the incident were later described by one of the judges as normal, intimate exchanges between a husband and wife. The prosecution's main problem was that their case rested entirely on circumstantial evidence. They argued that Samira and the 2 teenagers were the last people seen with Nazarin before his death, and Samira had entered Nazarin's room about 3 hours before the fire broke out. She was later seen standing on the porch as smoke rose from the house, making no attempt to call for help and showing no emotion. And they said the fire had been set deliberately, in specific areas to destroy evidence. The defense dismantled each piece individually. They pointed out that the chemistry department had found no traces of petrol on the walls, directly contradicting the fire and rescue department's findings. They also raised serious concerns about how the scene had been handled. Because the death was initially ruled an accident, the house had never been treated as a crime scene. It had been cleaned. People had continued living in it. The arrow fragments and the disconnected TV recorder weren't found until 3 months after Nazarin's death. The blood spatter wasn't discovered until 5 months after the incident. The defense argued that, given all of this, the reliability of the evidence collected from the site simply couldn't be guaranteed. And then there was Eka Wahyu Lestari, the family's domestic helper. She had been in the house on the night Nazarin died. She had been charged, and yet she had never been arrested. She wasn't hard to find. She was living in another city, working in a coffee shop, and yet she was never brought before the court to answer a single question about what she might have seen.
On June 21, 2022, the High Court cleared all 3 defendants without requiring a defense, citing a complete lack of evidence. Despite the family's call for answers, appeals continued, but each time the courts found no proof linking the accused to Nazarin Hassan's death. By January 7, 2026, Malaysia's highest court upheld the acquittals, declaring Samira Muzaffar and her 2 sons fully innocent in the eyes of the law. Meanwhile, another suspect remains at large and no one has been convicted. Nazarin's family says they aren't seeking blame, only the truth. But with conflicting evidence and unanswered questions, what really happened that night remains a mystery.